Great. So, hi everyone. I'm Stefan Ekman. I'm from Karlstad University in Sweden. And this part of my job is as fantasy scholar. I have a boring day job as well. Let's not dwell on that, um, or I might start to cry, and that might be unseemly. So, uh, the talk today is, I call it Magical Modernity, as an introduction to urban fantasy. And the subtitle is A Brief Anatomy and History of Urban Fantasy. A brief anatomy is basically because I wanted to use the word anatomy in a title at some point, and this seemed to be the one. I get to pick urban fantasy apart a bit. So that will be one part. And then the history of urban fantasy, much more straightforward, will be the second part. It's from my fairly recent book, Urban Fantasy, which is available for free download, open access at the DOI you see on the screen. And I will put it in the chat as well, if I succeed in doing that. That was more challenging than I thought. Sooner or later, I will put it in the chat once I figure out how. But clearly, I am technologically challenged at the moment.
Don't worry, I can do it for you.
Oh, excellent. Thanks. So, today's entertainment. The first part, as I mentioned, is what is urban fantasy? Or as I've called it more academically, a three-part model for understanding urban fantasy as a genre. And from there, we'll move on to what I call a braided view on urban fantasy development. That is, how did urban fantasy end up like this? Or, if you like, the history of urban fantasy. But I'll start off by saying, in case there are people in the room that have thoughts about urban fantasy and are knowledgeable, these are some common notions with which I disagree. The first one is that I don't think urban fantasy is a subgenre to fantasy or to any other genre. I believe it to be a genre in its own right. I realize that something called something fantasy is easy to sort of mistake for subset of fantasy, but no. Same thing. Urban fantasy does not, I would claim, have to be set in a city. I realize that urban suggests city, but my experience has been that there are also a number of works that behave exactly like urban fantasy works, except they're set somewhere else. They might be set in the countryside. They might be set in a small mono-industrial town. This is particularly common in Swedish urban fantasy. Or it might be set anywhere else in the world. But the thing is, it's question of, no, I'll save that. So the third notion with which I disagree is that urban fantasy has to be set in a version of our world. Worlds in fantasy literature and fantastic literature in general is a tricky concept, but setting and whether it looked much like our world seemed not to be determining anything in particular, really. They all seem to behave in the same way. So I'll get to this in more detail. Instead, I will start with what I consider to be urban fantasy. I came up with a sort of model. I hesitate to call it a definition because I don't like definitions. They have this tendency of either including too much. So I want to define something and I find that I also include stuff that don't really look like what I'm interested in. Or they exclude things that I feel, but this should be included as well. And it can't be because it's been found out. So instead I work with with a model. And it says that urban fantasy is a genre in the fantastic mode, whose cognitive model comprises a relationship between modernity and the fantastic, a core concern with the unseen, and a combination of traits from other genres. And I realize that this is dense and it requires some unpacking. So here comes some unpacking. When I say that urban fantasy is a genre in the fantastic mode, what I mean, well, first of all, what I mean by genre is a literary category, a category of text that seems relevant for me to discuss. Depending on who you ask, a genre could be anything. I have met people in my own field of studies, literary scholarship, that claim that there are only three genres and they were invented in ancient Greece. I have met people who think that there is genre and that's something bad, and then there's literature. And I met people who think that literature is one genre and thesis writing or theses are another genre, and technical manuals is another genre. It all depends on what you're going to use the category for. I rather like to claim that urban fantasy is a meaningful category to discuss, and since it is literature, I'll call it a genre. There we go. Fantastic mode. The fantastic, by that I simply mean all those types of fiction that deal with something impossible. The fantastic mode would include all the various genres such as science fiction, supernatural horror, ghost stories, fairy stories, fantasy, urban fantasy, anything where there is something that sort of goes beyond what we normally agree is possible in the world that we're familiar with, the actual world. So that's the first bit. It is a fantastic genre. There we go. Next bit, the cognitive model. As I said, I don't really like definitions, but we have ways of seeing various categories, and it could be any kind of categories in certain ways. And cognitive linguistics have this idea of what they call idealized cognitive models. So we might not be able to define exactly what a berry is. We have an idea what is a berry. And then we realize, of course, that if you ask a biologist, their model for what a berry is includes bananas. And my model of what a berry is includes strawberries. And we would not include the same things. But still, for me, the model for berry is something small and presumably sweet, and you could make jam. For a biologist, not so much. Thing is with these cognitive models that they come with some interesting side effects. For instance, they have what cognitive linguists call prototypal effects, prototype effects. The idea that some items in a category appear to be more typical than other items in a category. Some berries are more berry-like than other berries. And some fantasy works, like Lord of the Rings, seem to be more prototypically fantasy, more essentially fantasy, if you like, than some other works that might be just on the verges. This is something we apparently do because our brains are wired that way. It's not the way categories behave, it's the way we look at categories. That also means that my view of what is typically urban fantasy is going to be different from other people's views, but hopefully there might be similarities. So the cognitive model, and not a definition. This cognitive model then consists of three parts. The first, and perhaps I'd argue the most important part, is that it includes a relationship between modernity and the fantastic. So we've dealt with the fantastic. Modernity, by that I refer to, let's call it historical modernity or sociological modernity, the time period that sort of starts round about the 16th century. It's the time period when we're dominated by things like capitalism and industrialism and bureaucratic surveillance, and for that matter, and I'm blanking on the word, colonialism. There we go. I knew it was another C word. So that sort of changed. It became the Age of Enlightenment. It became the industrial era of the 19th century. And it became the time today. But it's been dominated by the same kind of structures, only they've developed over time. So urban fantasy can theoretically include a 19th century or 18th century setting, as long as it's modernity aspect of it that's in focus and not because people are running around in Regency clothes. So modernity. The second part of the model is that it has a sort of a core concern with the unseen. This is actually one of the first things I discovered when I started delving into urban fantasy. I came to this without knowing much about it at all, so I had to start somewhere. And by the unseen, I mean that it's not just, invisible beings, like people who are sort of magically invisible, wizards or fairies or vampires, but also that there are settings or part of settings that are in the center, like labyrinths underground, where there's darkness, there are corners, you can't see what's coming. So it's set around that, or for that matter, labyrinths above ground, where you can't see around corners in the city, you don't know what's coming. But it can also be unseen, as in that which we don't want to see. A typical example is homeless people, for instance. We sort of keep out of mind, and therefore they become sort of out of sight. And it could be people or groups that stay out of sight because they are, for instance, secret rulers or criminals or bankers. Also, there could be a combination of these. So you could have invisible vampire criminals in labyrinths underground. That would work. But usually it's not on the nose. But there's this core concern with the unseen. And finally, there's a combination of traits from other genres. So urban fantasy, as I said, I didn't find it to be a subset of fantasy because it also contained very clear traits, characteristics from other genres. You could have from science fiction, you could have it from romance, from adventure novels, from horror novels and the Gothic novel. The one thing that they seemed to have in common was that they always combined various traits. There was always this hybridity of urban fantasy novels. I also promised that I should say something about worlds. And that one of the things that I disagree with is that urban fantasy is always set in the actual world or a version of the actual world. And I seemed to find that there is an entire spectrum. The critic Mark J.P. Wolf talks about degrees of secondariness. A world could be more or less a secondary world. And I like that thought. So you could have And I'm going to illustrate with a few works to show you the sort of spectrum here. Like the television series Lucifer, which started running in 2016, you basically have our world, but you insert Lucifer and a few demons and another number of angels. But on the whole, very few, although they get more and more over the sort of the series. You get more and more angels, and Eve and Cain. But still, on the whole, not much. You have something like China Miéville's The City and the City from 2009, which is basically a detective story in a very odd setting. Two cities that are not side by side, but sort of superimposed. But they refuse to see each other, that they sort of unsee each other. So you walk along one side of the street and you unsee the people who belong to the other city. And you could also walk then on one side of the street, and that street would be in your city. The other side of the street would be in the other city. So you can't just cross the street. There is an official order checkpoint. So you'd have to go through that in order to move to the other, even if it's just a question of stepping across the street. It's a really weird setting, but there's, except of course for the sheer impossibility of unseeing on that massive scale, it's not particularly fantastic, although it is a brilliant book. Then we have worlds that are sort of divided up into domains, not necessarily completely separated, but they keep apart. Usually then one domain that's mundane, no magic, straight up, what we'd call standard life outside, and one that is supernatural in some sense. Ben Abramovich's Rivers of London, there is a supernatural domain. It's there just alongside everything else, except people don't really want to believe in it. And when you try to tell them, they don't want to acknowledge that you've told them. But it's there, and there is a police department for taking care of supernatural crimes. So it's not really divided, except it is. Other examples include a television series called Grimm that was around in 2011 to 17, where you'd have sort of fairy tale creatures living among us, but they just get hidden. So it's sort of part of hidden society there. If we move on towards the middle of the spectrum, you have something that's sort of like our world, but there is a major change at some point. Somewhere the world has changed. And I'm using the Sookie Stackhouse stories, which was also televised as True Blood in 2008. The basic idea is they've invented artificial blood, and it works fine for vampires. So suddenly all these vampires come out of the woodwork and start living among us. Just one tiny little change, but it has had a massive effect on the world. Other versions would then offer, for instance, a world in which magic comes back. So we have a future world, but there is magic. Leona Andrews' Kate Daniels series, for instance, is an example of that. Started in 2007, is still, as far as I know, going strong. But there we have a future where occasionally magic dominates, some other days it's science dominates, and it's all a bit of a mess, apparently. I haven't read all of the books, but the first book's definitely messy. Another favorite example is Aliette de Bodard, who's written a series called Dominion of the Fallen, where heaven started chucking out fallen angels, and they fell down into Paris, where they started little fiefdoms. The House of Shattered Wings is the first novel in the series. It's only 3 books. It is a very weird sort of 1920s or even possibly 1800, 1900 sort of millennium, turn of the century kind of shift feeling. I also have to say, for those of you who don't know Swedish, we don't call the 19th century the 19th century, which means I have to rethink every time and subtract one in order to get the right century. There's also Liz Williams' Detective Inspector Chen series with possibilities of writing email to heaven and hell. Or if you actually want to, you could go there. That means you could also phone your dead relatives if you want to talk to them. It's not as weird as it sounds. My example for the next part of the spectrum with two or more distinct worlds and possibility to travel between is weirder. This is your basic Narnia world, the sort of, one world, a wardrobe, and another world. Although the wardrobe could look like any kind of thing. And in Palimpsest by Catherine Valente, it's basically, if you've been to the secondary world or the city of Palimpsest, you gain a little tattoo of a part of the city map. That means that anyone who has sex with you will go to that part of the city. So it's traveling between worlds as venereal disease. Then you gain your own little tattoo of another part of the city. And so if you know where you want to go, you have to find the person with the right tattoo. It's not as racy and novel as it sounds, but it is very weird. And the city of Palimpsest is extremely peculiar. I can heartily recommend it. It's one of those books where I felt that my life had changed just a little bit after having read it because it's so. There are other examples. Of course, you'd have the typical fairy realm, like Sean Maguire's October Day novels, or Ted Williams' The War of the Flowers, where you have a sort of communist revolution in fairy. We have Jim Butcher's Dresden Files, also include some sort of fairy realms of various kinds. And then like I mentioned, Liz Williams's Detective Inspector Chen, you could go to heaven and hell, and that would sort of qualify as well as a different kind of world. So Richard Kadri Sandman's Slim series starts off with the main character clawing his way back from hell where he accidentally ended up, or possibly by nefarious purpose. And he tries to wreak havoc and revenge on people who sent him there. It's a fun romp for the entire family, I was going to say, but not necessarily for children. Finally, we have books set in something that has little or no connection to the primary world. And I've used my absolute favorite urban fantasy, at least favorite in a different world, Max Gladstone. It's the craft sequence. It starts with 3 parts dead. Oh, sorry. One way of starting it is by starting reading 3 parts dead. It's complicated. But it's an amazing world where magic is money. Because if you have magic, why do you need money? So magic in the way of soul stuff, parts of your soul, is also the currency. And various kinds of agreements and deals are then ways of conducting magic. So student loans can kill you if you don't pay them back. You really want to do that. But other examples would include China Miéville's Perdido Street Station, or for that matter, Terry Pratchett's Discworld series, which I claim turn into urban fantasy after a while. At this exciting point in the narrative, I also realized that I forgot to say why I don't believe in the city as a necessary setting. So I should add that it's because the city is so common in urban fantasy. And the reason it is common is because it's one of the most typical emblems of modernity, place where we routinely meet people we don't know. The city, the large conglomerate of people. Uh, so the modern world is a world where there are cities, and it's more common to live in a city than live somewhere else. So that's why I think people started with cities and then it became modernity, and some still think the cities are defining features. Let's move on to the history of urban fantasy. This is what I think the history of urban fantasy looks like, more or less. And I call it a braided history because I think it's a question of themes or strands of storytelling that comes into it in different ways at different points. So I see it as a sort of braid. It also means that these strands can be used, and you pick whatever strands you like as an author. You don't need to have all of them, the entire bundle of strands. You could just braid whatever together as you like. A thought I will return to. I've started with the 1840s onwards, where we'd have the proto-urban fantasy. I don't believe that urban fantasy started in the 1840s, but some key strands came together there without which I don't think there would have been an urban fantasy genre at all. I think it's extremely important, and you still see the traits that they brought with them as key traits in the genre. Now, those three key strands are the Gothic romance, the tale about the modern city, and supernatural stories. So before those three came together, I don't think there's any point in discussing whether it's proto-urban fantasy, because in that case, all literature is proto-urban fantasy, or proto anything you like, really, because nothing came from nothing, as it were. Someone actually suggested in one of the texts I read that the Gilgamesh epic was the first urban fantasy story. I feel that I have to disagree, but it is an interesting thought. So the work that I think illustrates proto-urban fantasy perhaps the best is Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol from 1843. It has a clearly Gothic feeling to it, but it is very much a story about London, and it has a supernatural element. It sort of combines these. It's not the only such tale that Dickens wrote, but it is a well-known one and therefore well-suited to use as an example. I could have used other examples, perhaps. Polydorus the Vampire from 1819 would have put us back a bit. But then I didn't feel that the city in The Vampire was much of a setting. It was more of a backdrop. It wasn't a tale about the modern city. A vampire story, certainly. Gothic, quite possibly, but not quite there. Same with Eugène Sue's Le Mystère de Paris, or The Mysteries of Paris, which John Clute calls a full-fledged urban fantasy in the Encyclopedia of Fantasy, but then he admits that it has no supernatural element. So it's very nice again, but hasn't got all three of them. So it's not quite there, but it is an important precursor, I suppose. I'm not going to trace the entire development of the Gothic genre or the Gothic strain or the Gothic mode. I've seen it called all these things, and I'm not a Gothic scholar, so I'm not going to sort of delve into that. But a Swedish Gothic scholar called Matthias Für suggested that the Gothic, whatever it is, strain or mode or genre, came in sort of waves, and that in the 1970s and for a couple of decades thereafter, there was a Gothic wave in various media. He talks about music and role-playing games and film and books. And since that fits with my view of urban fantasy development, I of course think he's right. So in the late 1960s and 70s, something happened. We had Tolkien's Lord of the Rings becoming incredibly popular. And people started to imitate and improve upon and experiment with it. And some of these experiments proved to be something that could lead up or did lead up to what we today call urban fantasy. And I'm going to use as an example here Alan Garner, because he experimented in so many ways. In 1960, he debuted with The Weird Stone of Brisingamen, where he took the fantasy quests that we're familiar with them from Lord of the Rings and put it into our world, and try to have the sort of pseudo-medieval feeling and modern society. In Elidor from 1965, he sends a group of children to a secondary world where they fight a sort of dark evil. They defeat it, but by defeating it, in defeating it, they use their own visualization of their own front door of their house to sort of lock it in, which also connects the two worlds via their front door at home in Manchester. So you have, in the night, people would come with axes and spears and start banging on the door, and there'd be marks on the door in the morning. But of course, that was in a different world, so the door exists in both worlds. It's a really interesting combination of the modern and the secondary pseudo-medieval fantasy world. And in The Owl Service in 1967, he combines modern sensibilities with Welsh myth in an incredibly thought-provoking way. Two other experiments worth mentioning is Randall Garrett's Lord Darcy stories. The first one was The Eyes Have It in 1964, where we have a 20th century based on magic rather than technology. And Lord Darcy is a private investigator, solves crimes. And I should also, of course, include one of my favorite German authors, Michael Ende, most famous, I think, for the Never-Ending Story. But he wrote a book called Momo, 1973, which is a very anti-capitalist critique of society, of modern society, where people in a rather modern type of fantasy world are lured to, or conned, in fact, to save time, as it were. Little grey men tell them that if you save this much time, you could put it away in an account and then you could use it all at the same time for something nice. And then, of course, they smoke it in their little grey cigars in order to prolong their lives. It's an incredible book, and perhaps its political critique is more important today than it even was in the 70s when it was first published. And I think at this point also urban fantasy, the adjective and the noun, became a phrase. It comes to mean something particular. It becomes like science fiction. It's not just fiction about science. It's a genre in and of itself. I like all good researchers, I wanted to find out when this was first used. And having looked through Google Books and a number of other sources, mainly Google Books, um, I could find it 3 times being used that way in 1978. Twice about The Wiz. Um, so the film version of The Wiz came in 1978, but it was based on a musical from 1974, which in turn was based on L. Frank Baum's The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, where Oz was New York. So very much putting a secondary world into a modern setting with Diana Ross and Michael Jackson. Um, it's an interesting film, and it was described as an urban fantasy in exactly the terms that we're used to today. The reviews are amazing in that way, and the interviews with various producers. So it seemed to be something that was already being used. My feeling that that was the case was became even stronger when I found a review by Aldous Budrys in the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction from 1978, where Budrys describes the tried and true elements of urban fantasy. So apparently there were tried and true elements already in 1978. The desuetudinous old rooming house and its counterculturist did practice this. Its counterculturist residents, the bit of old wilderness rising atop its mysterious hill in the midst of the city, and the strangely haunted, bookish protagonist who gradually realizes the horrible history of the place where he lives. I think Budrys might have adapted it slightly to fit Our Lady of Darkness that Leiber wrote, but it still sounds very much like a number of urban fantasies that I've read. Budrys also said that when we speak so glibly now of urban fantasy, we pay passing homage to the man who invented it in a 1941 story called Smoke Ghost by Fritz Leiber. So apparently to Budrys, urban fantasy is something that we speak glibly of in 1978. It has been around for some time. Apparently, I just haven't been able to find it in print. I'm assuming that he's referring to fandom at this point. I agree that Smoke Ghost from 1941 could be called an urban fantasy story, although I think it's more of a ghost story in a city. But Leiber's Conjure Wife from 1943 is definitely, to my mind, an urban fantasy story. In the 1980s, there are two strands, two changes or things that are added to the bundle. One is that cities themselves become source of the fantastic, where magic is not something external to the city, it rises out of the city. The most known example, I suppose, is John Crowley's Little Big, which is part of the Master Fantasy Works series by now, so worth reading. It's from 1981. We also have Diana Wynne Jones' Archer's Boon from 1984, which I really like. This is not the story of children's urban fantasy. That's a different story. Will be told in a different book by a different person. But it's basically about a city where the magical powers are the sort of major powers of urban life, banking and crime and sewer maintenance and whatnot. So that's basically a number of either wizards or magically inclined siblings that control the city that way. A wonderful book if you haven't read it. But my absolute favorite in these terms is Megan Lindholm's Wizard of the Pigeons from 1986. Lindholm went on to write a number of of secondary world fantasies under the name of Robin Hobb. But Wizard of the Pigeons is about either a wizard who lives in Seattle and controls, or has pigeons for friends and has a never-ending supply of popcorn and is being helped by the city, or it's about a Vietnam War veteran who is homeless and lives in squalor. The story is about the conflict between these two truths, these two versions of reality, and which one is actually true for Wizard. Um, Definitely worth reading. The other strand includes fairies and other mythical beings migrating into the city. The foremost person here is Charles de Lint. He's dominated part of urban fantasy, or some people like to call that particular part, this braid, mythic fiction. His first, I think his first book that's suitable in this genre, I should have written this in my notes, is Moonheart from 1984. And the first book of short stories that he came out with, Dreams Underfoot, was published in 1993 and included his writing from the 80s. And that was described on the blurb as an urban fantasy, linking it to, for instance, John Crowley's Little Big. So here we definitely have decided that urban fantasy is a thing. Other important works from the 80s when fairies come into cities are Terry Windling and Mark Allen Arnold's Borderland anthologies from 1986. And Emma Bull's War for the Oaks is also constantly mentioned. These are all about cities with fairies. I'm not exactly sure what else to say about them. It sort of describes them. And that is still around, I should say. This is very much a central part of the urban fantasy genre. The 1990s added investigator plots, vampires and other monsters as allies, or possibly even lovers, or both, and the tough female protagonist. The investigator plot has been around for a while. The story of psychic detective stories has been around since the mid 19th century. But towards the end of the 80s, we have Mike Resnick Stalking the Unicorn and I'm blanking on a name here. A story called Silver Blues about Garrett P.I. by someone Cook, whose name I can't recall. I'm sorry about that. These are really police stories or detective stories with a lot of fantasy creatures in a city. That's a sort of new kind of way, except we had Lord Darcy back in the 60s. So there's been a precursor for this. They fit fairly nicely together. With vampires, we have a change that started in around about 1967, perhaps, with the vampire Barnabas Collins in the Dark Shadows soap opera, starting off as a sort of very nice and, well, a human type of vampire. Swedish vampire scholar Anna Höglund divides the vampires from 1960s onwards into the monster vampires and the human vampires. And I think the human vampires then develop over time. And I could mention things like Robert Ekman's Pages from a Young Girl's Journal, won the World Fantasy Award in 1975, or the Dracula tapes by Fred Saberhagen, or of course Anne Rice's Interview with a Vampire. We have this constant change of the vampire figure into something more relatable. And by the 1990s, they have entered the bundle of urban fantasy as allies, sometimes even protagonists in Tanya Huff's Blood books, for instance. And in fact, Huff's Blood books are interesting because they illustrate all three of these strands, where the main character, Vicky Nelson, is a former police detective and now private investigator. She works together with a vampire, and she's definitely a very tough female protagonist. So it's an interesting example. Usually when there's discussions about tough female protagonists, Buffy the Vampire Slayer comes up. And I personally don't think that Buffy affected the urban fantasy genre. I think it was an expression of the same thing as the kick-ass females in the urban fantasy genre, a sort of desire for a better feminine protagonist, perhaps. Um, I think Xena, Warrior Princess, is another possible such example. This is the final strand to add, and that's the new weird. The new weird was not an offshoot from urban fantasy. It's more like a case of parallel evolution. So many of the building blocks are the same, but it also includes the genre mixing and formal experiments and a very political point of view that you find in new wave science fiction from the 1960s, combined with a sort of transgressive horror from the 1980s, with a focus on monsters and the grotesque. But so many works that are claimed for new weird are also claimed for urban fantasy. So I think, in fact, new weird was the one to lose out. It doesn't seem to be around as much anymore as a label. The works that are claimed for both include Perdido Street Station by Mieville, City of Saints and Madmen by Jeff Vandermeer, also 2001, A Year in the Linear City by Paul de Filippo, and The Etched City by K.J. Bishop. The Etched City is a really strange read, and I enjoyed it a lot. Starts out in the middle of a desert, so clearly very urban. But that was probably the last strand to be added. I haven't seen anything after that. So in the 2010s, it was more a question of braiding your favorite strands together for authors, and for readers, identifying what kinds of braids you preferred. And then, of course, there was this constant discussion about what is the core or the heart or the true center of the urban fantasy genre. If you look at discussion lists and discussion boards from that time, that's one of the most constant concerns, trying to explain what urban fantasy is and then dividing it into a number of subversions when you're trying to get the whole things together. The other thing is an attempt to expand the genre horizons and to strive away from any perceived center. Try to find the edges and then go a little step beyond the edges, push boundaries and make it more different, and to meld things together in various ways. So you have this sort of opposite movement, both towards the center and away from. And then the really interesting things that happen in the field between, where writers are trying to do a little bit of expanding, but also staying true to some sort of tradition. And that's basically it. Again, my book is available for free. Either you can go to the Joy on the screen here, or if you've got a Kindle, it's also possible to download it for free from Amazon if you're thusly inclined. And if you want a paper copy, it's possible to buy one of those as well. But have a look at it first for free. That's what I would do. So thank you. Thank you for listening. And I'd be happy to try to answer any questions or just debate.